I think we'll get started. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Grand Rounds. It's good to see faces without masks, at least to the extent that it used to be. Today, it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Elwyn Clark. Dr. Clark is an intensivist with us, and and just to give you some background, he obtained his degree in osteopathic medicine from the University College in California, and then did his residency in emergency medicine at New York Medical College at the Metropolitan Health Center Hospital, and a fellowship then again in trauma and critical care medicine at St. Luke's in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And since then, he has worked all across upstate New York and been an attending physician in ICU and critical care at Olean General Hospital, where he was medical director of their ICU, at Mercy Hospital of Buffalo, at Metropolitan Health Center, Harlem Hospital Center, and most recently, before joining us, he was the medical director of ICU at Hamilton Medical Center across in Dalton. Now, what you may not know about Dr. Clark is he has a very global perspective, and he has spent a year in Cairo, and he's got a degree in international studies and the Arabic language. And he's a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy Reserve Medical Corps. He's going to talk to us about a topic which is far from his actual day-to-day field, and that is the impact of global health on global climate change on global public health and population health. And I want to just tell you that coincidentally, last night I was talking to my sister over the phone in India, and she's in Delhi, and the temperatures in Delhi are 45 degrees centigrade in the shade during the day. And the wet bulb temperature in Southeast India is now 35 degrees centigrade wet bulb temperature, which is the max compatible with life for 6 hours. And with that, there's load shedding, which is the term used for switching off electricity during peak consumption hours. And folks are not going out in the fields. The agricultural sector has been terribly hit. And so it's really important that climate change gets addressed. And I'm delighted that Elwyn Clark is going to talk to us about that and public health. Thank you. Take it away, Elwyn.
Thank you, Dr. Sethi. Good morning, everybody. Just to add a little bit about my interest in this topic, I am currently working on my master's in public health at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. I've always had an interest in global health, reaching back to when I was an undergraduate studying in Egypt and at a time where I thought my life was going to go in a very different direction. But now, as an intensivist, I see the effects of chronic disease and how climate change is impacting the severity and increasing the number of those who are suffering from chronic critical illness, which then brings them to the hospital and then brings them to us. But overall, climate change in general is an incredibly broad topic, as I'm sure you can all imagine. Every one of the topics that I'm going to talk about today could, in their own, be a lecture by themselves. And I've actually given some individual lectures on air pollution and tropospheric ozone and things like that. Perhaps maybe the next academic year we'll have such discussions. But overall, what is climate change? So we're going to assume that everyone in this room accepts the fact that climate change is happening. It's the foundation of this lecture, so there will be no discussion as far as whether climate change actually exists. So it's essentially, we're warming the earth, and it's an anthropomorphic warming of the earth, meaning that it's driven by human beings. And this is mainly driven by the consumption of fossil fuels. So not just the combustion, but also the extraction, refinery process, as well as the use of fossil fuel. And in addition to that, we also have agriculture. Industrial agriculture is also a large contributor to climate change in the form of greenhouse gases. And CO2 and methane comprise 90% of our greenhouse emissions annually. And the CO2, again, is it comes from our combustion of fossil fuels, and the methane comes from our agricultural industry, our also waste disposal, landfills, things like that. And the interesting part is that even though CO2 is the larger percentage and the larger contributor to greenhouse gases, methane actually has a stronger effect. So even though it's only 10% of the greenhouse gases, it actually has a larger impact on retaining energy from the sun and contributing to rising surface temperatures. So greenhouse gases by sector. So about 70% are used for energy, and this is from industry, transportation, our built environment, essentially the buildings that we live in, the cars that we drive. And then the next largest is agriculture, forestry. Again, looking at how industrial agriculture, especially the essentially the meat industry, has a tremendous carbon footprint. But we're also dealing with situations such as deforestation and land use. So one of the major issues that we sort of discuss globally or broadly is the idea that climate change is affecting the entire world. However, those that are suffering the most from the impacts of climate change are typically those countries that have contributed the least to our carbon footprint, our carbon emissions, our greenhouse gases. On the left, we have a graph that shows that China is responsible for about 30% of our greenhouse gas emissions, the United States 15%, India 7%, and then on the other side is more of a sort of an atlas depiction or a global depiction of the countries that are contributing the most to greenhouse gas emissions. But the lower graphic is showing the difference in the countries that are being affected the most. And that is mainly through the effects of severe weather events, extreme heat events, drought, and loss of land due to rising sea levels. Which is generating a total, or this concept of a climate gap that is not only global in nature, but also local as well, and certainly something that we see here within the United States as well. So I actually tried to get rid of the animation, but I'm not quite PowerPoint savvy, so we'll just wait for it to complete its cycle. So clearly this is not my slide. I borrowed this from the CDC. And but essentially what it's showing us is that there is this continuous cycle of increasing greenhouse gases, which is leading to increased temperatures, extreme weather, rising sea levels. And then on the outer circle, we're seeing where things are starting to affect population health. So air pollution, changes in vector ecology, water quality, extreme heat, severe weather, all of these are now having direct impacts on populations. Next, we'll start talking about some of the specific impacts of climate change. So the first one we're going to talk about is air pollution. So air pollution, again, is the product of the combustion of fossil fuels, and also exacerbated by weather patterns and location and things like that. But it essentially is a product of our use of energy production. It consists of carbon dioxide, ground level ozone or tropospheric ozone that actually is something that's created in a chemical reaction with sunlight, with other byproducts of fossil fuel combustion. And then also we have to deal with particulate matter, which is something that I'll talk about specifically in just a minute. But the effects on air that we breathe, it affects both inside and outside. It increases aeroallergens that we breathe both, again, outside and inside, and can increase the number and severity of respiratory illnesses. Tropospheric ozone decreases pulmonary function. You also have prolonged allergy seasons or prolonged periods of time where you have pollen producing plants that are potentially contributing to allergen sensitization, increases in asthma, things typically affecting children, and also more in urban environments. But as far as particulate matter is concerned, so particulate matter, specifically particulate matter 2.5, which is essentially byproducts of fossil fuel combustion that are smaller than 2.5 microns across. Why is this a problem for us? It's a problem because it essentially can bypass all of our defense mechanisms and lodge themselves in our alveoli, where not only do they cause local inflammation, which then leads to respiratory illness itself, and can lead to, the end product of inflammatory diseases, but also it can actually get into our circulation through the alveoli. That's how small it is. So then it ends up in our end organs, in our kidneys, our heart, our brain, again, causing inflammation, contributing to cardiovascular disease, stroke, kidney disease. These all can be attributed to, at least partially, to the inhalation of particulate matter. Next, we're going to talk about severe weather events. Extreme weather events are increasing in severity and frequency, especially extreme heat events. In the past, extreme heat events didn't get as much attention from the media because it's not, it's not like a hurricane, it's not like a coastal flood environment or a tornado. But thermal or extreme heat is actually the #1 cause of weather-related deaths in the United States and most likely worldwide. But one of the interesting things is that FEMA does not offer assistance for extreme heat events. So local communities are typically on their own to try and address the impacts and the effects of a prolonged heat wave. And this typically affects vulnerable populations more than others, outdoor people who work outdoors, children, the elderly, and those in low-income communities and communities of color. There's the direct effect of heat itself or heat-related illnesses. As Dr. Sethi mentioned, when you get a heat bulb temperature above 35, you're essentially, your body, you can no longer, your sweat no longer evaporates. And then your body loses its ability to auto-regulate its temperature, and then can spiral out of control into starting from heat cramps to heat stroke. But they also can worsen chronic diseases as well. Prolonged heat exposure is associated with increased hospitalizations for cardiovascular disease, respiratory pulmonary illnesses, as well as kidney disease. And then as far as the other things that are on here, droughts have an indirect effect. Not only does it contribute to water insecurity and water scarcity, which as water resources become more scarce, it can lead to poor sanitation and increase in water-based illnesses or waterborne illnesses. But also leads to food insecurity as well, which then leads to climate migration, so the mass movement of populations, and increasing conflicts as the need for resources or the lack of resources and who's going to have control over them increases. Currently, we're just like Dr. Sethi had mentioned, India and Pakistan are dealing with an incredible heat wave right now. It's unclear as far as the mortality numbers that are coming out, but I'm sure they are much higher than they are being reported. And what this leads to is, you've got millions of people subjected to extreme heat conditions. It leads to an increased demand for power, which then leads to an increased consumption of fossil fuels. The vast majority of electrical plants in low and middle income countries are coal-fired. So there's an increased demand for air conditioning, increased demand for electricity, increased demand for coal to burn, to create that electricity, to then provide the air conditioning, resulting in coal shortages and power outages in much of middle and low income countries. But it's just this perpetuating cycle. Whereas in comparison, just the last weekend of April, the state of California was actually able to provide 100% of its power needs by renewable resources. 70% of that was from solar. So it lends to the idea of international aid and pathways forward on how to deal with these things that we'll discuss a little bit later. But it certainly does impact development, because overall, Since the Industrial Revolution, high income or developed nations have essentially built their economies on the back of fossil fuels. And over the short period of a couple hundred years, we're now seeing the devastating effects of what that has caused. So how can we, as an international community, try and facilitate progress in low and middle income countries that does not rely entirely on fossil fuels? Where can we export those technologies that that could provide renewable resources, renewable energy? So these are things for our policymakers and for us, because we all need to vote. In addition to the severe weather, also contributes to vector and waterborne diseases. As the changes in weather patterns continue, it affects the reproductive cycles of mosquitoes, ticks, fleas, but also the diseases that are carried by these vectors. Examples of vector-borne diseases that the US tracks: tick-borne diseases, Lyme, rickettsia, ehrlichiosis, mosquito-borne West Nile virus, malaria. But the most striking example of the expansion of vector-borne disease is with Lyme. We have seen that as the climate change in the Northeast has produced longer periods of warm weather, and that warm weather has reached further north, we're finding that Lyme disease is expanding from it's no longer a Northeastern United States problem. It's expanding into the Midwest. It's expanding up into Canada. So it's one of the prime examples of how climate change is affecting the proliferation of infectious disease as well. Then we have, which we've talked about a little bit already, but the secondary impacts of climate change on public health, which are changes in weather patterns, changes in growing seasons, changes in agricultural patterns in general. So right now, California is dealing with a drought that's been going on for like 20-something years now. They will ultimately, Lake Mead right now is at 30% capacity. And this reservoir is what supplies water to Las Vegas, San Diego, pretty much most of Southern California, but also for agriculture as well. So not only are we depleting the Colorado River, which is happening due to decreased ice packs and things like that, but the aquifers that are in the ground are deep water deposits that take centuries to restore, are also being used aggressively for agriculture to try and stave off the economic consequences of drought. But in lower and middle and lower income countries, those are not options. So you have essentially a decrease in food security, you have decreased crop yields, increase in carbon dioxide in our environment has actually been shown to decrease the nutrient components of basic grains, rice, wheat, decreasing the amount of protein that is in them. So leading not only to a decreased crop yield, but also less nutritious food, leading to the idea of a more malnourished population. And then yes. Then we have the social and mental health effects of climate change. We often talk about social determinants of health, but as areas of the world, as parts of the country become more and more uninhabitable, we're going to be dealing more with climate migration. And so people trying to move from areas that have such extreme periods of heat to places that can be a little bit more supportive of life. However, this in our current geopolitical environment can lead to increasing geopolitical conflicts, as well as displaced populations, which then also lead to further humanitarian crises as far as widespread illness in displaced populations, because there's often difficulty in maintaining sanitation and food supply in large displaced population centers. And then the communities at risk. So our social and economic determinants of health. So those who are most at risk, older adults, children, low income communities of color that are still reeling from the effects of redlining, which was a practice done in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that essentially was a form of segregation that placed communities of color more likely closer to industrial locations, and we're still dealing with that, and then there's also the built environment itself, and the idea of a urban heat island. So you take a city and you take away all the vegetation, you take away all of the greenery, you fill it with cement and concrete buildings, and you create a hotter environment, which then you need more energy to cool, and then at night your natural cooling isn't enough, and it becomes a spiraling cycle, which is seen sometimes in our large cities, Chicago, New York, LA, especially in the summer months. So essentially, how do we address this? Well, it's, we need to start to try and build resilience into our built environment and share technologies. And as far as a path forward is concerned, I think we all agree that we need to decrease our dependence on fossil fuels. But we also have to assist other nations in developing economies that are not dependent on fossil fuels, and are based on renewable energy and changes in agricultural habits. And that is what I have for you. If you have any questions. Yes.
The illusion that, every morning I go out for a walk or run downtown with all the particulate matter. Am I helping or hurting my lungs? And should I be wearing this mask while I'm exercising outside?
So fortunately, in Chattanooga, we do not have the populate or the air pollution uh, burden that a lot of other places do. Back when Walter Cronkite said that Chattanooga was the dirtiest city in the country, that was when back in the 60s, when there was a lot of industry still here. Since then, it has decreased significantly. So, but to answer your question, yes, inhaling your particulate matter is not helping you. However, are there other health benefits of exercising? Yes, of course. But the overall process of trying to decrease the number of, decrease the concentration of particulate matter in our atmosphere is really the goal.
Thank you, Wynn, for that very insightful and rather depressing talk, but really useful and important. I recently read a book by a Ugandan climate activist that also left me feeling sort of hopeless. And we recently bought an electric car, and then this morning my husband told me that electric cars may not even be better for the environment than gas combustion cars. So I was just wondering, in your research, did you find anything positive, any progress, any good things you can tell us about climate change and maybe any impact that we're making?
So
or not?
we are making an impact. The United States has decreased its CO2 emissions over the past 15 to 20 years. Are we doing it at a rate that it will actually help? Is still yet to be seen. There are graphs out there that show if we decrease our our greenhouse gas emissions by a certain point, we will level off and hopefully avert a climate catastrophe, which is generally considered to be an average increase in temperature of 4 degrees over by the end of the century. However, right now, most of the projections are still that we're, exponentially using. And unfortunately, a lot of it has to do with our, with our political, milieu and, who makes money off of fossil fuels and who makes money off of renewable energy. And there's some thought out there that these large solar farms in the middle of the desert might also have a negative impact on the environment. So do we need to move more towards individual, solar paneling? Do we all need to individually become, sort of energy independent on our own? The electric car thing. I agree. I've also been thinking about getting an electric car. But then you have to think about, the child labor in Chile of the people who are digging up the lithium that's being used in the lithium batteries and what is the impact of that on our, on our environment. So yeah, no, these are complicated issues that our elected representatives do not appear at the moment to be up to the task of tackling, unfortunately. Yes, Aaron.
Well, Dr. Clark, thank you again for really tackling a very important topic in our future. I'm going to back up a bit away from that. There we go. So my question for you is, you mentioned the Industrial Revolution, and that really seemed like a linchpin in terms of pinning economies on fossil fuels. Of course, there was a quality of life improvement in those industrialized countries. Do you think that we're still in the Industrial Revolution? And a follow-up question to that then would be, do you think we're going to be able to legislate our way out of it, or do we truthfully need a technology revolution to make these renewable techs cheaper?
My personal opinion is that I think that we need a technology revolution. and are we still in the Industrial Revolution? I mean, it's not really a revolution anymore. We just now live in a constant state of industry. But where the impact can be focused is on parts of the country that are still developing, so that are just now starting to go through their their industrial revolutions and building their economies on fossil fuel based industry. I see that as the biggest impact, where a technological revolution could change our direction, and also not just technology and CO2 production, but we also need to look at agriculture, and there are ways to reduce the amount of methane that's being produced by our meat industry. And some climate scientists are actually advocating that if we can reduce the amount of methane in our environment, that we actually may be able to stave off a climate catastrophe, because methane does not, it breaks down more quickly in our environment than carbon dioxide does.
This works, yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Clark, for this. Kind of what I took away from it, just a reflection I wanted to share. Your talk really hits on the outside of the hospital, outside of our medical reach, the things that are going on that we can do to help. And it really just made me think about our milieu right here. You know, behold the factory of health that we work in, called Erlanger. It seems like so much of medicine, as I know it, is built on this industrial idea of, you have a serious problem, you come to us, whether that's the hospital or the clinic, and we use our resources, fix you, send you back out to the same issue. Your talk just made me think of how important having that outward focus is, when so much of medicine, as I've experienced, is inward focused. Come to our resources. I don't have an answer, but it just provokes in me a desire to want to see, what can I do to make the lives of my patients better where they're living them.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, I mean, medicine in general, we treat problems, right? So, and we're not very good at prevention. So somebody comes to our office or comes to the hospital because they're having an issue that we then need to treat. There isn't a lot of focus on looking at what precipitated that problem and how can we prevent that from happening. There is some research in precision medicine, which still has a lot of research to be done. But one of the things that I personally am researching is a biomarker associated with heat-related illness, and trying to determine if there is a way that you can gauge the impact levels of heat are having on an individual before they start to demonstrate symptoms. And that's is something that is severely lacking in the literature. But yeah, no, we need to focus more on prevention. We need to focus more on how to keep people healthy in an environment that is working against us. So, and especially for my outpatient colleagues, looking, when your patients come into your office, looking at their social situation, what are their social determinants of health? Do they live in a place that does not have access? Do they live in a food desert? Do they not have access to open green spaces? Are they having to decide whether they can pay their electricity bill to run the air conditioner, or buy food? So I think those are things that we as physicians can start to impact on.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clark. It's really a good talk. I have two questions, more like interest of mine, because I come from a third world country. One
We don't
is
say third world countries anymore. We say developing countries
developing country
or lower
I mean,
middle income countries.
lower income country. But like we don't use AC as much as here. So it's normal to walk inside a house and there will be no heat, no air conditioning in it. And even though the temperature can be really not that hot outside, but because there's no air conditioning anywhere, so it will still hot. It's still really, really hot. So it perpetuates that heat cycle. So I understand what you're saying. So it could be 40 degrees Celsius, but really it will be augmented even to more because it never cools down.
Right.
The second thing is what's the impact on global nuclear energy instead of local? Because we all know the local impact of the nuclear energy plants, but does it really contribute to the global health?
So just if I'm understanding your question, are you asking if nuclear-based energy production can be a solution to
instead of fossil fuels, to turn on turbines and all those things?
So nuclear energy has a very sort of specter of a bad reputation. Whether that's deserved or not, I don't really know. But there are small groups of individuals or small groups of organizations that do advocate for increasing nuclear power. The problem is that our nuclear regulatory agencies are outdated. We haven't moved forward in nuclear energy outside of the military in the civilian world since the 50s and 60s. So looking to make sure that there is safety and what do we do with the waste products of that. But is it a possibility that it can contribute? Absolutely.
Thank you for the reminder of impending doom. And obviously, other than voting, is there anything that we can do here as staff at Erlanger to help? I know that the hospital is a very wasteful place. Have you looked into hospital waste and how that can be reduced?
It's interesting that you ask, because it is something that I have started just over the past couple of weeks, is trying to look at the practices of Erlanger itself and trying to see if there could be some buy-in into making this a greener organization. But I'm in the very beginning stages of trying to research that. But as an individual, we can certainly also make adjustments in our own lifestyles. And it might not seem like much, in the bigger picture. But if each person changed one, if I biked to work one day a week, would that affect, overall climate change? Probably not. But if I could get the entire medical staff to do that, it's a possibility. So, but we ultimately need to change how we behave, which is not an easy thing to do. Absolutely.
And you really informed us a lot about the impact of climate health on public health. I'm wondering, in your research about biomarkers, whether you've come across any research related to identifying populations biologically that may be at higher risk, not just socio-economically.
No, actually, I haven't. But it's also because I haven't been looking at that specifically. All right. Thank you, everybody.